that's part of where your book goes, right? Staying human in an era of AI.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a mixed vision. So in this way, I
Yeah.
really try to follow what the Catholic Church has been. I mean, I work as a Catholic philosopher basically, and as a try and remain a Catholic, faithful Catholic, and think with the Church through these issues.
Hmm.
And the Church has very consistently taken this line that says that AI as a technology is not in and of itself a bad thing. In fact, that's never been the church's line. It's never been anti-technological in the way that other Christian traditions have been, right? So you can think about the Anabaptist traditions who have had a much more explicit anti-technological stance. And the Catholic Church just hasn't had that, and in fact continues not to have that in relationship to artificial intelligence. That said, especially with Pope Francis, talked a lot about what he called the technocratic paradigm.
Hmm.
And the technocratic paradigm is more than any given one technology. It's more a way of understanding ourselves, our environment, and each other, and the way that technology can mediate all that. And Pope Francis really thought that there was something problematic with this very reductive way of understanding humans in our environment and the way that technology mediates between those two things. And AI seems to be, in some ways, right now, the pinnacle of that implementation of that kind of technology. So I would say that I try to follow that kind of balanced perspective of saying, is there something intrinsically wrong with the technology? No. Can it even be put to good use? I think yes, and I think even obviously yes. At the same time, does the form of the technology sometimes lend itself to a problematic way of understanding ourselves as something that's just that we are only things that take in inputs and put out outputs? Yes, I think it can do that. Can it lead to a reductive way of understanding the world around us and other people? Yes, I think it can have that too. So I would say I try and present a mixed case of not being a flat out denial, but also of using it and thinking about it with a healthy amount of skepticism and sort of intentional use as well.
I think that's ideal. It's exactly it. Why don't we just keep right on going with this conversation? Because
Perfect.
I'd love to understand, how did you get into this whole thing at all? Two, what's the connection that you bring with AI and then speculative world building and fiction, as you've got with, what was the name of the conference? A faith that builds worlds. I love that. The second convention that we did for Legend Fiction, it was called Worlds Without End. In
No, that's
that
great.
sense of like how an author is, what is it? It's like a worlds within a person, infinite worlds within a person. Also, it's taken from the liturgy, world without end, amen. Right?
Yeah, of course, of course. I love it.
Yeah. So, how did you get into AI, and then what's your connection to storytelling? And we can get into all that,
Yeah.
but let's start with AI. And how did you get
Yeah.
into it as a topic?
Yeah. In a way, I think that it was a topic that was coming towards me for a long time. So I started my academic journey as a English literature and writing major. So I love storytelling, I love writing, I love fiction. And sort of, I won't get into every single step of the journey, but eventually I figured out that a big part of what I liked about storytelling and a big part of what I liked about fiction reading were the ideas in it.
Mhm.
And so I thought, oh, so I kind of like philosophy as well. And needless to say, by some meandering roads, I eventually wound up specializing in philosophy rather than fiction, but still retained that love of fiction throughout the process. As I was finishing up my graduate work, I started thinking about questions of the human mind. So, philosophy of mind is sort of the broad field that thinks about the relationship between the what do human brains and human psychology and human mind and human consciousness, how do we understand the relationship between all those things? Almost everyone agrees they're related in some way, right? The mind, the brain, psychology, consciousness, there's some relationship, but the precise nature of that relationship isn't clear. And there's a whole area of philosophy that thinks about that. So that's what I started doing my work in, which of course is already AI adjacent, because these are the same sorts of questions that we ask when we're confronted with human-like intelligences that are not in fact human, that are different biologically, that in fact don't have brains. So the way that you answer questions in philosophy of mind actually ends up not just being this theoretical speculation, but has very real implications for the ways that we understand artificial intelligences. So again, kind of working in philosophy of mind, retaining this love of storytelling, retaining this love of fiction, having these questions about,
Because we're
yeah,
because we're both nerds here, do you have like a favorite episode from some TV show or serial or something that captures kind of what you're talking about, to
that's,
put
I
some
mean,
imagination on it?
yeah, I mean, I would say the character of Data. I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, so my Star Trek was Next Generation and a little bit of, I watched a lot of Voyager too. That was sort of the versions of Star Trek that I grew up with. And the character of Data, I mean, of course, this isn't just one episode. This is a recurrent theme. Is to what extent is Data, who's an android, of course, in Star Trek Next Generation, to what extent is Data human? To what extent is he not human? And what is it that essentially makes us humans and separates us or doesn't separate us from machines? I especially remember, I think, Star Trek First Contact, which is one of the movies, the Next Generation movies with the Borg. It's maybe one of my favorite Star Trek movies. But there's a subplot where Data gets an emotion chip finally. So he finally can experience emotions. And I remember that as being a really interesting, is adding emotions into an android. Is that the thing that finally makes him fully human? At the end of the day, I mean, maybe disappointingly, I loved Data, and I think my gut told me he was human. I've arrived at a place where I actually think that an android can't be a human being. There's some important differences, but I think those questions that Data and Next Generation raised were just spectacular, and again, just kept coming back to it from different angles over and over again.
Yeah. So you've gone on to write a book about AI. So let's talk about staying human in an era of artificial intelligence. I'm interested in how this connects specifically to indie fiction authors. That's the audience for this show and for the con, for our community. So what thoughts or recommendations or advice? Yeah, I know you wrote the whole book on it, so I'm asking you to give us the précis of the thing, but specifically for authors, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I think that there's really two parts to the book. I think one is maybe more relevant to authors. The first part of the book has to do with the way in which we understand ourselves. AI in many ways holds up a mirror to humanity. So I think it's an important moment in our culture for us to really step back and reflect, what is it that separates us from machines? That's more of a philosophical question. It's maybe a question that has practical implications, but I think that's more of a theoretical way of approaching self-understanding. I think the more practical questions that I raise in the book that are relevant for authors are, how do we go about deploying it in our working and creative and professional lives? You know, I don't have, Dominic, I don't have like, here's the 3 things you need to do that are appropriate and the 3 things that aren't appropriate. What I encourage people to do in the book is to think about, what is it that boosts our humanity and what is it that undermines our humanity? And you could get more specific and think about, what is it that boosts our creativity and what is it that undermines our creativity? And use that as sort of a good, again, it's not going to answer questions like that, but it is going to be a nice guideline for thinking through specific cases of AI use, specific cases of, should I use it to this, that, or the other thing? I think we can ask ourselves is this helping make me more creative? Is this helping me be more human in the process, or is it undermining that? I'll give you 2 thoughts that sort of maybe make this even a little bit more concrete. I heard he was a theater professor who was talking about this, who does a lot of staging of plays and very creative guy. And he talked about how he'll use AI to start thinking about how he might want to stage a scene, right? He'll say something like, I'm doing Hamlet, but I want it to be kind of 1920s Chicago mafia themed or whatever. And
Well,
you know, what kind
cool.
of, yeah, but you know, just I don't even remember what his example was, but sort of what are some things you would do? And he says, sort of always the suggestions it gives are not the thing he would do, but a lot of time it will give him 3 or 4 ideas and he can look and say, idea 2, not that, but the reason not that is really interesting. And then he's off and running thinking about what he wants to do. So I think that's a good test case of a case in which our creativity isn't being undermined, but is in fact being boosted. The one other example I just wanted to give you really quick is a big fan of Brandon Sanderson, the fantasy author. And he just had a video post recently where he's taken a fairly strong anti-AI stance. And part of the reason that he takes that stance is, I think, related to what I want to say, that one of the most important things that we do in creating something and writing fiction and world building is the effect that it has on ourselves. And I wouldn't say with him any reliance on AI. I don't know if that's his position anyways, but I think that there's a certain threshold in which we cross, in which all of a sudden I'm not the one doing the creating anymore. And even if the product was the same, you've lost the most essential part of the process.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And there's especially when it comes to like art, I know that he's made strong points about the fact that you're commissioning something like an art director, but I think it's totally fair to then say, don't call yourself a creator if you're commissioning someone or something to do that for you. And that's why with our community, because we're a community built around writing and about the actual craft of writing. So you show up and do that. Find a way maybe for these tools to augment or inspire you on the side, exactly like your friend with the play, but don't actually have it do the work for you, because then you haven't yourself learned anything. And there's something we see we see storytelling as a vocation. This is a specific way that we collaborate with how the world is, with how we are, with how reality is, with how inspiration works and how the spirit works. All of that comes together in the act of focusing attention around imaginative creativity and so on. You've said something interesting a couple of times, and I'm very curious in your take on it about we can think of AI as a way to understand ourselves, and how throughout history or so on, in the history of philosophy, is we routinely turn to specific things in our environment as a way to understand how we work. I know we've done a bunch of different things, like in the Industrial Revolution, we thought, oh, well, we must be machines because we've built really good machines. And then that runs aground. And now we look at it and go, oh, well, we must be some kind of agentic, bio AI thing and so if we could just prompt it right, stuff would work better. And then we're still early in that model, but it's already kind of falling apart. And that's kind of one reason why we want to hunker down in legend fiction to do the stuff that we do, because like, no, you're bigger than just something like that. What goes through your mind with that? What are some things that you caution or encourage people to think about on this topic?
Yeah, I think one thing that I would encourage people to think about, and this comes directly out of the church's teaching on AI, is to think about what human intelligence actually is in its most robust, enlarged sense of that term. And this, I think, would go beyond just Catholic audiences as well. I think this is just a good route to take when thinking about this. And there's this recent document published by the Vatican called Antiqua et Nova. And it's great because the first half of it goes through sort of a very systematic account of all the different aspects of human intelligence. And it talks about how human intelligence is relational, it's embodied, it's oriented towards the truth. There's all these different things. And as you go through it, again, you don't have to be Catholic to look and say, well, of course that's true. Of course my intelligence is relational. Of course my intelligence depends in certain ways on the kind of embodiment that I have and things like this. And then by the end of that, and you've read these 6 or 7 different things, and you kind of have this bigger picture of intelligence, and you realize, oh, wait, of course I'm not just an agentic model. And of course my intelligence is not exhausted by something that an AI can do. Can an AI do part of what a human intelligence can do? Yeah, it can do it really well. But can it capture the whole thing? I think the answer, if we really systematically think through what human intelligence is clearly not. This is, again, the sort of shifting over to Sanderson again. I think he makes a really interesting point here, too, that he talks about how models right now are not quite able to write, for instance, a full novel. But apparently there's tests that have already been done. I don't know how scientific they have been, but tests that have been done where you can get a model to replicate a paragraph or two in an author's style and then have that same author write a couple paragraphs, and people can't tell the difference, right? So you might initially see that and think, oh no, like it's taken over the creative space entirely, because only give it a few more years and pretty soon it'll just be able to churn out the full novel and you won't be able to tell the difference. And Sanderson's point is that might be true, but if you think that we've lost creativity in world building, then you've actually missed what creativity in world building is, because it's not just the product. Like, the product is obviously an important part, but like you were saying, Dominic, arguably the most important part is the creative act of the world building that goes into it, the relationships that are forged in the making of it. And AI can't do any of that. So even if it can produce, again, paragraphs that look like a human wrote them, that doesn't mean that it's undermined the whole process.
Yeah. Oh, that's so great. So what would your most optimistic take, and then I'll ask maybe if your most pessimistic take on this whole thing, looking ahead, looking to the future, what might be your more optimistic take on the impact this will have? And again, specifically for indie fiction creators and stuff, because you're presenting at this faith that builds worlds. I love that title. That's the faith that we do have. We want to build a future that we believe in. There's a lot of fiction that does not do that. And this fear that our attention and our dollars can be strip mined by factories of stuff that are pretending to create things when all they're doing is just shipping. And it may not be slop. Some of it might be actually, passably okay. But the problem is we're humans and we want to be, and we're supposed to be, in the future that we're building. And we want to tell each other stories that help us, as a friend in the community says, stories help us to be wise and to be brave. And we go about that all kinds of
Love
different
that.
ways. And so, um, like you say, we're relational. So stories are a relational. They're a part of how we build relationships with each other, with the future, and with the past, and so on. So, most optimistic take that you might have about how creators, use all of this into the future.
Yeah, I think my optimistic take is for creatives to use this as an opportunity to step back and reflect on what it is exactly that we're doing and what the value is in what we're doing. And I think that however you want to describe the way that we're formed, whether it's industrialization or the idea that storytelling and world building are all about making a product that then turns a product. So you could tell all sorts of different stories, but I think we've been oriented to think about the point of telling a story, the point of producing something is to get it to market and to sell copies or something like that.
Right.
And I think that's a pessimistic take, right, in some ways. But I think my optimistic take on this is that the AI moment might force us to look and say, oh, wait, AI can make products maybe as good, maybe not quite as good, but can make products that are pretty good. And maybe, though, that actually wasn't the point of what we were doing all along to begin with. Maybe actually it is relational. Maybe it is about formation of myself and helping form others and, forming the world around me in certain ways, and sort of thinking back. And I take it that this is a part of a longer conversation, but my optimistic take is that AI is forcing us to think through these questions that maybe we already should have been thinking through in a more systematic way. And now it's kind of forced our hand where we have to say, okay, so if it's not about the product, what is it about? How can we have a more robust understanding of creativity and world building and storytelling that isn't just taken away by AI? And actually, it won't be that we're like retreating or anything. It's that we're developing the robust account of storytelling and world building that we might have believed all along and just hadn't articulated. So that's my optimistic take.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. I'll ask you about your pessimistic, your dark take in a second. I saw a really interesting correlation that made a lot of sense about people who go stuff like, well, if you're using AI in any capacity, then no, thank you. I would prefer the slow, more human-centric experience of maybe me with a blank page in 2 years of my life, or maybe I'm handwriting or something. It's like, I want that long, slow experience, right? And the thing is with that argument, it seems to me, to say that that is superior, that is more human, you could say the same thing about gardening and the fact that you should never use tractors because it's more human to be in the earth and working with plants. And, okay, I would agree with that argument, except that there are a lot of people who don't want that experience, maybe don't have the luxury of that experience, or they just may not have the charisma or the calling to be the kind of person who is in the dirt and slowly going through you will learn a lot of wonderful human things by going through something very, very slowly, but not everybody is called to do that. So I could see that also then being applied to, there are ways to use AI, for example, as part of your creativity that doesn't replace you, and it is going to speed up specific aspects, also because a lot of how we live our modern daily life is completely fake and arbitrary and did not exist 100 years ago. And it makes sense that we would then bring in tools to eliminate tedium, speed up stuff that literally destroys our creativity. So there is a place for it. If it's not for you, well, then that's fine. Nobody's forcing anybody, but what's the dark sense you might have? And feel free to push back on anything.
Yeah, no. I actually wanted to follow up on what you were saying right now because I think it's really interesting. I actually, if I had a tendency in this debate, or if it's a debate, this conversation is maybe more accurate description of what's going on around AI right now, is my gut tells me the sort of slow and methodical is the more human way. I have sort of a little bit of a Luddite streak, right? I'm on technology all day long, and I like to think of my
at heart. So that same sense of like, just eliminate
I just want
all of the
to be with my
stress, slow
trees
it
and my
down.
tea in a hobbit hole. Yeah, I mean, I just probably read too much Tolkien, and I have the vision. No, Samwise Gamgee is living the good life. That's what I want for myself too. So I'm sympathetic to that line actually, but very similar to what you just were saying about what are the implications of that view. I was kind of in a class once. I was trotting out a line kind of like that. Here's Samwise Gamgee is living the good life. And really don't need technology. We just need our tea and a hoe and a garden and, go out and plant your own potatoes and that sort of thing. And a student raised his hand and says, well, here's a thought experiment for you. Suppose that I live a few blocks from campus. We live in Chicago, so we have good public transportation. And it's a really nasty Chicago day out. And I'm faced with the decision between taking the bus, the nice, warm, right, heated, weatherproof bus, and then maybe to the L, and I can get to the campus that way. Or I could, because it's always an option, I could pull on my boots and trudge through the snow for a half a mile and feel miserable all day. He's like, are you really going to tell me it's more human to trudge through the snow? And it was kind of a little gotcha moment, because it's like, well, yeah, I guess in a way it is. But at the same time, none of us are going to opt to say it's more human to trudge through the snow for a half hour. So I'm going to
Let's just
avoid the
pull on
bus.
that for a second. What does it mean to be more human? Because humans build tools to
We do.
solve specific
do.
needs all the time. And that's part of the, what is it, the glory of man and all of that stuff,
Yeah, totally.
is to figure out those sorts of things. So what is your answer? Or like what goes through your
Yeah,
mind as far as an answer to
I
that?
think it's really tricky. Again, the Luddite, the Hobbit in me wants to say the less technology, the better. But at the same time, of course, part of human nature is the fact that we build things and alter our environments, right? You wouldn't say that a beehive is unnatural because the bees built it. No, it's perfectly natural to them. In the same way, we are the sorts of beings that build houses and use tools and shelters and things like that. So I think it's a really tricky question to answer and a really important question to answer. And I think that it's more complicated than it initially seems.
Right. Yeah. No, I think you're right. And it seems unavoidable that there's two factors in this conversation, which is the interest and the needs of the individual, and then how you're choosing to use your attention and how you're choosing to do effectively to do good with it. Are you familiar with she's another professor, I think, Diana Pasulka? Have you ever heard of her?
I do. Yeah.
Okay, she's written a book. Then I just burned through it like a couple of months back. I don't think it was American Cosmic. It was her second one, which I think is called
Encounters, I think.
Yes. And
Yeah.
there's one chapter
I've
in there on
actually
AI.
got it on Audible as we speak.
Okay,
So I am,
okay.
I'm about a third of the way through it right now.
Okay, so have you gone through the chapter where she talks about AI?
I think I'm right at the start of it, but I haven't gotten into the weeds of what she has to say yet.
Well, darn, we should have got this recording afterwards. It doesn't matter. She's got the person that she's talking to raises a point which I thought was fascinating. I'm curious then your take on it. She talks about the fact that as the human family has become so much more closely connected, and all of these connections and relationships have accelerated like to an insane level over the last 100 years. She says that person she's talking to who works with AI said that humanity would have always needed to have created some kind of a tool like this to function as an augment, a cognitive augment, to do all of the networking and the relationship and the data sorting, because we're now at a point where a human family or people in power or authority or whatever have to now respond at increasing rates of rapidity for problems or crises or good things, or even not even just that. The amount of data that now is all coming together from multiple fields of study it's beyond what just mere human minds can fathom. And so I'm not putting down the whole Hobbit thing, because I think maybe for most of humanity, I think that is still the human ideal. It's like, that's a healthy, safe way for people to live. But at the same time, it is also true that there's all of this that needs to be reckoned with. Increasingly, the demand for how to reckon with it is increasingly more difficult. And so tools like this would have always needed to be created. Now the question is what to do with them, how to relate to them, how to maintain our humanity, which sounds like your central thing. I thought that was a fascinating and hopeful point.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to get to that part of the book. I mean, I think that it's I don't know if I want to call it a problem, but it's a phenomena that builds on itself, right? Is that we make more data, then we need things to deal with the data, and then as we build things that deal with the data, then there's even it's sort of as sort of all this stuff iterates, so that, like you said, it's just exponential, the amount, even compared to when I was growing up, which was not that many decades ago. Just the amount of information and data that exists now that we need to deal, and connectedness that we're dealing with now. It does seem like we could have gotten by without AI in the 90s. But today, given just how much there is, we need something to be able to deal with it all. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I think that there's part of me, I'm guessing part of most of us, unless we're thoroughgoing transhumanists, that long for a simpler past and long for the Hobbit life. Mm-hmm. But that's not a life that we're going to live anytime soon. I mean, unless you live completely off the grid, which even then I think it would be illusory to think you're completely off the grid. You're still dependent on systems that the fact that you could live off the grid is still going to depend on things going on in the modern world. So
ensuring that you get left alone.
Yeah, exactly. So I think then the question has to be, we can maybe think about what it means to be human and think about what's changed since the modern world has given us this sort of new way of living. But at the same time, I think we need to really into what you just suggested. And what I want to suggest too is, here's the environment we're in. How do we stay human in this environment? And rather than longing for some past that is impossible to achieve.
Yeah. So what are I don't think I got a chance to ask you this.
Yeah.
Areas of concern, what are you concerned about?
So my
immediately
concerns,
and then into the future.
My concerns about the future, some people who talk and think about AI a lot will talk about things like artificial general intelligence. Eliezer Yudkowsky has this new book that's really interesting. If anyone builds it, everyone dies, which the thesis is exactly what it sounds like. So that, AI could take over the world and in fact wipe out the human race. And I don't think that they're very smart people that have some of these theories. Those aren't the problems that keep me up at night. What keeps me up at night is the vision of a future in which we have so outsourced different aspects of our humanity to either AI or to other technologies that our own individual humanity is so attenuated and atrophied that there's hardly anything left of it. I'll give you just one example. Almost all of us at this point have shopped out our geographic navigation to our GPSs on our phones. So that, I don't know if you've had this experience, but you're going to a place that you've been like a dozen times before and your phone's dead or something like that. And you realize, I don't know where Dominic lives. And I've like been to his house like 12 times, but I've always used my phone. So we've lost this connection to nature and this sense of direction and sense of where we live. Was there anything intrinsically wrong with using GPSs? Well, no. That would be a strange moral teaching to say that there's something intrinsically wrong with using a GPS. But I really worry about how kind of by little bit here and little bit there, AI and other technologies kind of rob us of our humanity so that 20 years from now, we wake up and all sorts of human capacities have just slowly slipped away and we don't have them anymore. So I worry about that more than I do about AIs taking over and killing us all.
Right.
It's probably good that somebody's thinking about that too.
Well, I think it's probably the optimist in me because people like you and I got to live here for another, hopefully 50 years. And so that kind of future it's obviously not very interesting. But also, like I look at what just happens around us, every month, if not every year, there are incredibly smart people who are diagnosing the problems just as quickly as, as we are. And then they're building or doing the stuff that would actually forestall that, or they're just, they just come out and share their release like a year later after everybody's signed off, like, yeah, it's going to be an apocalypse. And then like 6 months later, oh, look at this new tool that's been slowly changing things. A tool is an augment or an amplification of a whole lot of human intention. So that's interesting. I think there's a lot of hope because I'm also convinced, and as for Catholics, heaven has not abandoned us. It's continually, rigorously, daily engaged with this whole situation. We're not alone. So let's talk about this faith that builds worlds. Like, I love that moniker, that description. Maybe that can be the closing thought. Why is Christianity, or Catholicism specifically, a faith that builds worlds?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as we were planning this conference, I think what we were thinking about primarily was the ways in which world building and Catholic ways of seeing things in some ways are obvious. I mean, Tolkien articulated this as good as anyone ever has. But at the same time, those two aren't all, I mean, I think you're doing really great work in this space, but those two aren't always put together. I think sort of there's, Tolkien did it. There's people out there who are doing it really well, but we don't, at least in academic spaces, always think, well, where do we look to learn about Catholic imagination and a Catholic view of building up a world? The natural place is in science fiction and speculative fiction, science fiction, right, fantasy, horror. And at least in the academy, we don't always look there. So I think one thing I'm really excited about is to think about ways in which contemporary modes of world building intersect deeply with Catholic ways of seeing the world. I mean, I think that what it turns on in a large part is this sacramental understanding of the world. And this idea that God is found in the stuff around us and in the stuff of the world, and that God comes to us in and through the world, so that by exploring that world and by reimagining it, we can also reimagine ways of encountering God. So I think I'm not a fiction author, so I'm sure other people could talk about this more eloquently than I can. But I just think that it's a really exciting space to think through Catholic themes in, that that I'm really excited to bring a group of people together to help us think through those things.
Agreed. That's exciting. Two last questions. What's something that you have watched or perhaps read this past year that you absolutely loved?
I just watched Guillermo del Toro's new Frankenstein adaptation.
Yeah.
It's
Did
on
you enjoy
Netflix.
that?
I did. I thought it was really good.
Okay. I've seen
Yeah, I
that too.
thought it was very Del Toro, right? So if
Okay.
you don't like Del Toro, you're probably not going to like it. But I thought it was a good adaptation of Shelley's Frankenstein, which there's been 1,000,001 adaptations of Frankenstein for film, and they've
Right.
gone from being like not true at all to better, and this one's on the better end of things. But I think I just really, so Del Toro is adamantly not a Catholic, but also adamantly not a Catholic anymore. And he,
Right.
I think, has admitted himself that once a Catholic, always a Catholic, right? He sort of thinks about and imagines worlds in a way that's essentially influenced by his Catholic upbringing.
Yeah.
And this movie,
He's very
especially,
sacramental about his
it's very, and
his
this,
approach.
I don't know if you've seen it yet, but the movie,
have.
especially, there was, I mean, I just think it was a thoroughly Catholic imagined reality in many ways, even though there was a lack of God. Like it's sort of clear that this was a Del Toro movie, right? There's not sort of a redeeming presence of God in the movie, but at the same time, it's a very Catholic formed imaginary that he's presenting. So I really liked it. I thought it was really interesting, and I just thought it was a really good adaptation of Frankenstein too. So I really enjoyed it.
Agreed. No, that was very fun. I need to pick your brain on that one because that was a good movie. So last question: what advice or recommendations would you have for our audience, indie fiction authors, specifically Catholic ones, around this topic of faith that builds worlds, and then how that overlaps with your work on AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I would say is, again, kind of returning to this idea of not losing sight of what makes us human and what creativity and world building is as we're navigating an AI populated world. I think that where we clearly lose is if we allow some of what makes us human and where our humanity comes out in world building and in writing and in just thinking about the world, when we've ceded too much of that to artificial intelligence doing that work for us. And I think it's a fine line. And I think that it's one that we're each going to have to seek with discernment. There's a fine line where a brainstorming session with ChatGPT all of a sudden turns into ChatGPT actually kind of taking the lead. And where does that line get crossed? I think it's going to be different for individual to individual. There's obviously extremes, right? Write the whole novel for me. Like that's clearly been crossed, and not using it all. Like there's clearly no line has been, but there's gonna be a place in the middle where lines get crossed. And I think just having our vision of what creativity and world building is, and having a fairly clearly articulated vision of what that is, and then once we have that vision, we're going to do a lot better at identifying where either AI or other technologies are undermining that and where they're in fact helping and facilitating that.
Yeah, and then last question. We've sort of gone around this maybe a couple of little times, but I'm curious if we were to articulate, or you were to share, what is the vision of human creativity and human imagination? How would you describe or define that as something that grounds you, that anchors you, something that we can then meditate on and apply?
It's a great question and such a big question. I mean, I think, and this is going to be a pretty, I'm sure, an answer that you get from other people too, especially in the Catholic tradition, but that there is this sub-creation activity in which, in the act of creation, we are coming alongside God, who is ultimately the creator, and in a strange and mysterious way, not doing the same sort of thing that God does. Of course, we're not doing that, but we're participating in the kind of thing that God does in creating us, and we are joining him in that creation. I mean, I think here's the Tolkien reference of the creation story, where creation is carried out through song. And what are all the figures early in Tolkien's creation myth doing? Well, they're singing along, and and just this idea of joining into the chorus that God has already set for us. I think there's something really beautiful and mysterious about that. That's, again, I'm not the first one to say this, but I think that's where I think creation as a Catholic creator really becomes exciting, because there is this mysterious sense in which we're somehow sharing in what God does in his creation of us.